Hey everyone, welcome to our Transgender Allyship presentation for trans students at Patrick Henry.
So a quick note is that this presentation was made by trans students at PHHS in the Students Anti-Discrimination Committee, or SADC, and is distributed by the No Place for Hate Committee. I'm Lucy. My pronouns are they, them, theirs. I am non-binary and am in 10th grade.
My name is Xander Carrick. My pronouns are also they, them, theirs. I'm non-binary, gender fluid, and a junior here at Patrick Henry.
Hi, I'm Iris Drake. I'm a junior as well. I use he, they, and it says I'm non-binary, but to be honest, I'm not entirely sure.
So what does being transgender mean? A commonly agreed definition within the transgender community for transness is deviating from one's gender at birth, deviating from one's assigned gender at birth to satisfy their sense of self. That being said, transness is a very difficult thing to define. So just trust trans people if they say they're trans.
So some terms to know. Gender dysphoria means to feel uncomfortable when you present as your gender assigned at birth or are referred to by the wrong pronouns. Gender euphoria is when you feel joyful whenever you present as your real gender. Other terms, AGAB, assigned gender at birth, AFAB, assigned female at birth, and AMAB, assigned male at birth. Gender nonconforming isn't necessarily trans, but sometimes included under the trans umbrella. And identity for those who deviate from the standards of their assigned gender or their what's typical of the gender expression. A non-binary trans person is a trans person that is neither a man nor a woman. It's not a third gender. It encapsulates every gender outside of the binary, and not all non-binary people use they, them, theirs.
So some additional terms to know can be dead name. It is the name that is assigned to a trans person at birth if they choose to use a new name after transition. Cisgender or cis is to identify with your AGAB or assigned gender at birth. Transmisogyny is the hatred of trans women referenced within the ideology of trans exclusionary radical feminism. To be out or outing is to have one's identity known to the public, and outing is the act of publicizing someone else's identity, usually without their consent.
And finally, gender confirming surgery. Gender confirmation surgeries encompass a group of surgical procedures, including facial feminization or masculinization and genital reconstruction. Transition. Transitioning is the process of expressing your gender identity, typically socially and or medically. Detransition. Detransitioning is the process taken by some individuals to stop expressing their gender identity as they had before. This process is often undertaken by those who are forced back into the closet or people who realized they were not transgender. And finally, questioning in reference to queer people, people who are questioning their identity, may that be their transness or sexuality.
So sometimes there's a little bit of confusion as far as terms. So trans women are people who have transitioned into women for whatever reason. Trans men are people who have transitioned into men. And trans women and trans men have always been their gender. They did not become women or men. They just chose to begin expressing themselves out that way to the public.
So this is how trans identities are understood. So there's the wide umbrella of transgender, and then there's the umbrella of binary, trans man and trans woman, and then there's non-binary. And you can have labels under non-binary if that is comfortable for you, such as genderqueer, gender fluid, etc.
And some common GNC pronoun sets to know. Xander, I'm sorry, I started speaking.
No, you're all good. So she, they, a person who uses both she, her pronouns and they, them, theirs pronouns with a preference for she, her, hers. Alternatively, also there is they, she, a person who uses both she, her, hers pronouns and they, them, theirs pronouns with a preference for they, them, theirs. The same logic can be used and applied to he, they, and they, he. And any and all pronouns, a person that uses any pronouns would like you to use any pronoun set on them. You can use he, him, she, her, they, them, and etc., but try not to use the same one all the time. Think about this for the same way in she, they, he, they, and etc. Alternate if you can. And finally, they, them, theirs. This is the pronoun set that most non-binary people use, fairly self-explanatory, but also note not all non-binary people use this pronoun set.
And we're going to talk a little bit about finding importance in pronouns.
Just because I may present more femme doesn't mean that I'm any less they, them.
You know what, that thing where you're eating a meal, but you're not really eating a meal, you're just kind of picking at food on the counter. My family and I were doing that one night, and I just kind of looked at them and said, hey guys, I'm non-binary. I don't have a gender.
In my opinion, gender is a universe. It is a broad spectrum of planets and stars and sky that truly cannot be contained into a binary.
My pronouns are they, them, theirs, and that's a non-negotiable. And they were all kind of like, okay.
I think one of the main reasons pronouns are so important is because other than our name, it's one of the main ways that people identify and call us.
My pronouns are personally very important to me. Growing up, enculturated into kind of a system that really subscribes to toxic masculinity, I was always uncomfortable with being called dude, what's up, man. I was so bad at dapping people up, how guys do that whole like that thing. I was so bad at that, and it just I felt very alienated every time someone would do that to me.
So when someone identifies with a pronoun, they're essentially taking their little piece of that broad universe and identifying with that. And so in using their correct pronouns, we're validating that yes, you are right in your identity and you are important and we're respecting you.
Coming into terms with my gender queer identity has been one of the most challenging but also rewarding things that I've done.
Laverne Cox kind of famously said, misgendering a trans person is an act of violence. And it is. It's an act of psychological violence. It's a denial of somebody's personhood and a complete refusal to acknowledge their identity, whether intentional or not.
And so it is something that is entirely wrapped around our everyday lives. So just walking into a restaurant and hearing someone say she, will happen within 2 seconds of me entering, which doesn't happen about any of my other identities. They're not gonna be like, oh, you straight person, that doesn't happen. But automatically someone will make assumptions about gender which translate into pronouns, which mean that I will hear over and over again people saying something about my identity which is false.
I think a lot of people associate expression with identity, and sometimes that's not the case. Oftentimes I'm in situations where I'm not the most safe being able to express my gender identity, and in those cases, even in those instances where I'm wearing basketball shorts or sneakers, you can't take my gender identity away from me because that's mine and not yours.
So many different options for who you are and how to define that. So when someone chooses a personal pronoun that they identify with, using that pronoun is a form of respect and a form of validation that, yes, this is your rightful identity, and I will respect that.
And I know personally when I get misgendered, by strangers it's one thing, but it's especially painful when it's people who are close to you. So when my parents misgender me, it's a knife in my heart because they're the people whose opinions matter more to me than anybody else's.
And not knowing how to combat it. It is constant, and it is such a prevalent part of our society that being misgendered happens countless times in a day, and that builds up really quickly, and it can really be difficult for a person to hear over and over again because it invalidates your identity over and over and over again.
Pronouns are important because they are the smallest and easiest way that you can acknowledge somebody's identity.
And I also don't like that people call them their preferred pronouns because it's also not a preference. It's who they are. You need to use those pronouns. It's literally an extension of my arm or my leg. It's just as a part of me as a vital organ. My identity, although you can't see it, still needs to be validated just as much as you would validate the fact that I have 5 fingers or 5 toes.
I'm helping trans students do's and don'ts. Use their pronouns. If you mess up, apologize quickly and move on. If they come out to you, make sure to be kind and supportive. You also need to ask if you can use their pronouns in certain settings, such as in front of other people, especially parents, or at school. Defend them openly if other students say something transphobic. And add your pronouns to your Zoom display names and welcome all students to do the same. And some do nots are called pronouns preferred pronouns because, as stated in the video, they're kind of required. Apologize excessively if you use the wrong pronouns. You can just say sorry and move on. Make excuses for why you struggle to say the right pronouns. Applaud yourself for using the trans student's pronouns correctly. It's the bare minimum. Say my trans student / friend, unless you are talking specifically about trans issues. Invalidate the experiences of trans students. Uses trans students' dead name. Out students without consent. Or ask invasive questions about genitalia, medical history, or sex life.
And some good habits to keep inside and out of the classroom. Ask for pronouns. Always ask in a private setting rather than in front of others. If you ask for pronouns, also ask for permission to use them in front of other people. Treat trans students like any other kind of student. Never single out a trans person. And also accommodations to our support and accommodations to support our transness, does not equate to special treatment. Be an active advocate. If a student makes a transphobic comment, take immediate action. And be casual. If a trans student comes out to you, do not make it a big deal. Chill vibes foster a sense of safety.
So now we come to the slightly more touchy topic of activism and what defines good activism and allyship. So primarily all activism and allyship should center the marginalized group in question. So if you're a cis person, never talk about trans issues unless you're, acting as a witness to transphobia, or you feel like, for whatever reason, you can support a trans person's voice by speaking up in a certain circumstance. But again, always center trans people if they are there. So what does bad activism actually look like? It's priding yourself on your ability to accommodate trans people. So using a trans person's pronouns, respecting them as an individual, that is the bare minimum. And it should be understood as such. Begging for trans people's forgiveness after making a mistake, be that mistake dead naming or misusing pronouns. It sort of centers your feelings, like, oh my goodness, I'm so sorry, I didn't mean to. Just like apologize, move on. Make sure the trans person first and foremost feels comfortable before searching for forgiveness. Do not speak over trans voices. Again, experiences between cis and trans people are entirely different, and our opinions and voices need to be highlighted. Performatively showing your support for the community. Again, showing support is great, but don't use it as a way to get higher social capital or, for whatever reason, center yourself. As opposed to the support of other trans people, and mistaking allyship for a ticket to abuse and appropriate our culture. And this is another point. Allyship is earned, and it's given by this marginalized group in question. You cannot label yourself an ally because you are not trans.
So something to keep in mind is that it's better to admit you don't know something regarding marginalized people's issues than to take an uneducated stance, further increasing possibility of harm to the marginalized group.
And finally, the cost of transphobia. So here you can see this is a map that has been color-coded based on numbers from 2008 to September of 2020. As the colors get darker, the heavier the numbers are. You can see in the US alone, we are currently in the range of 251 to 500 trans murders. But also remember, trans and GNC murder victims are often misgendered when reported. So the numbers on your screen are much more likely to be disproportionate to the true statistics. In 2019, a trans or gender non-conforming person was murdered in the US at an average rate of once every 2 weeks. Over 80% of these victims were specifically Black trans women. In teens, 50.8% of trans men, 41.8% of non-binary people, and 29.9% of trans women attempted suicide in 2015. So please, when we talk about trans remembrance, please respect those lives that were lost.
So these are some student supports. These links will be accessible on the slides, which should also be accessible on the SADC Instagram or the No Place for Hate Instagram. And if you are struggling with anything, if you're being kicked out or anything like that, these are great support systems to help you.
And then finally, we're going to talk, so obviously right here, we have transgender, non-binary, and gender non-conforming student rights. Pretty basic stuff. We have the right to use facilities, participate in sports, dress in a way, all that matches our gender identity, name and pronouns, right to assert our gender identity at school, whatnot. Relatively simple stuff and definitely important. And if you have any questions about this presentation, please visit the No Place for Hate website. Select the events tab that I think will be up here, and then click LGBTQIA ally on the drop-down menu. The SADC committee, which we are part of, will be answering questions, and responses will be posted on the website and on our Instagram at No Place for Hate at PHHS.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.